Hi, so I watched Friendly Space Ninja's video about Riverdale again, and boy oh boy, I have some thoughts. I'm still working on a comprehensive look at Riverdale's narrative, but I really need to talk about this first. His video has over 5 million views, so I'm sure what I'm about to say is pretty controversial, but I've got to say it. Friendly Space Ninja is wrong. He's wrong about Riverdale, and more specifically about Cheryl Blossom, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, in my last video, I said that I no longer cared about whether or not Riverdale was bad because of the personal experience I've had with it, and that is true within the sanctity of my own experience. And I know, I criticized the show a lot in my last video, but I was trying to showcase my journey from ignorance to bliss, and there was a time where I considered Riverdale to be worthless trash. I no longer feel that way, but I don't think I did the best job of explaining why. So, let me be clear. Riverdale is an important piece of queer art with essential representation for lesbians and neurodivergent people. If Mr. Space Ninja doesn't like the show, that's fine, but let's not pretend that his video was real critique when it demonstrates a clear misunderstanding of the story. Strong words, I know, but hear me out. Let's talk about Cheryl Blossom. Cheryl Blossom is one of the most important characters on television these days for the following reasons. Number 1, she's one of the only lesbians who is a series regular. And number 2, she's neurodivergent in a surprisingly authentic way that displays the bitter and complicated reality of what it means to cope with serious trauma. Now let's unpack that. So, lesbians have had a tough go on television. They usually just die or they're in the L word. That's kind of it, actually. Cartoons like Steven Universe and She-Ra have seen some lesbian activity, but even then, it was brief. Cheryl Blossom is a series regular on what was once one of the most popular shows on the CW. It's not anymore, but still. And though Cheryl has died, once, she has never been killed off. If anything, she's only gotten more important as the show has gone on, and her very existence is just so nice. Lesbians typically get the short end of the representation stick, though so do trans people, bisexuals, asexuals, and basically anyone who isn't a cis gay man. There simply aren't lesbians on TV, and when there are, they're typically killed off a la Denise in The Walking Dead, or in a throwaway scene a la Annalise Keating and her ex-lover Eve. Remember that? I think about that one a lot. Lesbian-centric shows like Gentleman Jack and First Kill just get canceled after a season or two. And let's be real, the L word was only allowed to go on as long as it did because it was pornographic enough for straight men to still get something out of it. Nah, maybe that's just bitter speculation, but I don't know. In any case, Cheryl Blossom is a big part of lesbian representation right now. She's a main character with lots of screen time, and she's super gay. But is she good representation? Some would say no, because she's not a squeaky clean Girl Scout in a healthy relationship, but I'm not interested in that. Keep your sanitized, socially acceptable gays. I'll take a messy, villain-coded queer any day of the week. Verily Bitchy made a fantastic video about this called Good LGBT Representation is Boring and Why That's a Problem. I recommend taking a look at her video. It's great and beautifully articulates why good representation often feels stiff to the point of just being boring. Cheryl Blossom is a problematic character, but I kind of like her that way. And that actually brings me to item number 2 about why Cheryl Blossom is so important: her neurodivergence. Neurodivergence is a broad term that encompasses people on the autism spectrum, people with ADHD, people with mental illnesses, and more. What makes a person neurodivergent is the fact that their brain works differently, and this difference can come from a variety of sources, both genetic and environmental, depending on what flavor of neurodivergent you are, and some people have multiple flavors. Before I go into the next segment, please know that I am not a psychologist. Let's just say I know my way around these streets a bit, and you can draw your own conclusions about that. Now, I know it's a slippery slope to armchair diagnose a fictional character with any sort of mental condition, but what I can say about Cheryl with some conviction is that she's often delusional, has extreme emotional reactions, that she dissociates, that she hallucinates, and she has a boatload of trauma that could lead to all of that. You look me in the eyes and you tell me she's not dissociating here. Like, she is out to sea, barely notices when Penelope smacks her. And this is one of the most extreme examples, but there are tons of them. Basically, anytime she snaps into that bitchy defensive mode of hers, I affectionately refer to that as bombshell mode. Now, some of the things that Friendly Space Ninja called out about Cheryl were that she doesn't develop as a character, that her characterization is inconsistent, and that the trauma that she has endured should have changed her forever, but if you consider the way that delusion, dissociation, and emotional volatility play together in her personality, he's completely wrong. What he claims is the problem with her story is her story. I think the fact that she moves forward and then regresses is one of the points of her character, and it reflects a very real experience that people with trauma have. Progress isn't always linear, and it's kind of nice to see that play out in Cheryl's story. Part of what he called out in terms of her inability to change was the example of her sexual assault. Nick St. Clair drugs her and attempts to rape her in season 2, but Josie, the Pussycats, and Veronica kick the shit out of him before he can. You get him, girls. Cheryl is clearly affected by this, and Veronica reports this to her parents. However, when Hiram and Hermione tell Penelope, she shuts them down, saying that nothing actually happened. Immediately after this, Cheryl recedes into a highly defensive, clipped manner where she parrots her mother's words and lashes out at Veronica. A surface-level reading might assume that Cheryl is no longer affected by this, but that's not what I see here. Cheryl is not allowed to hurt. She was raised in an invalidating environment where her emotions have earned her judgment, criticism, and violence, as shown in the aftermath of Jason's funeral. As a defensive mechanism, Cheryl dissociates from her emotions, and when she does that, she typically becomes very aggressive, often dangerous and destructive. This happens throughout the series and is actually very consistent. Penelope won't let Cheryl be in the school play. She covers herself in blood and threatens to burn down the house again. The core four are going on a romantic weekend and Cheryl awkwardly invites herself and then is humiliated by their rejection. She stirs the pot. Cheryl learns that Tony is getting married. She casts a curse upon the union. Like, need I go on? Anytime Cheryl is even remotely threatened, no matter the intensity of the real or perceived slight, it activates her fight or flight, and she mostly fights. But not always. In fact, going back to the Nick St. Clair incident, years later in season 4, she sees him in the Maple Club during the arc where she and Veronica team up to sell rum. Cheryl sees him, immediately freezes, has a flashback, and then leaves in a tearful panic. Claiming that Cheryl wasn't changed by her trauma is just not true. She clearly carries it with her throughout the series. And this is just one example. There are many others. So the problem isn't that Cheryl's trauma didn't change her. I mean, you don't drag a corpse into your house because you're just fine. The problem is that it didn't change her in a positive way, which sounds crazy to say it like that, but that's the kind of story that a lot of people want to see about the mentally ill and disabled people in general. And yes, mental illness is a disability, like, don't get it twisted. They want to see disabled people made better by their pain. They don't want to see the ugly parts. They want to see the victory where mental illness is defeated and the person becomes more humble, more kind, and an inspiration to us all. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Yeah, well, sometimes what doesn't kill you just fucks you up. And honestly, it's refreshing to see a character depicted that way. Her mental health problems aren't solved in an episode or two. They're an ongoing problem, and thus we see how trauma can change a person and continually influence their life and the lives of those around them. And I understand the resistance to that kind of narrative. It looks like harmful representation, the kind that makes people with mental illnesses seem like monsters. And to be fair, this conversation is really complicated. The way that mentally ill people have been depicted in films are usually as villains or serial killers, which is harmful representation because it distorts public opinion about mental disorders by making them excuses for horrific behavior. But at the same time, some of the more modern attempts to provide mental illness representation are almost the opposite. There's a push to almost woobify mental illness, to make it less scary and more socially acceptable. A sort of, just talk to a friend if you're depressed, then it'll be all better. Okay. But I hate this just as much, if not more, because I think it further stigmatizes disorders with scary, ugly symptoms like Cheryl's. And that's not great either, because it's sort of untruthful and inauthentic to the experiences of many people. But is Cheryl Blossom good mental health representation? Probably not by most people's definitions, but I feel about this the way I feel about the L Word's representation for lesbians. It's problematic for sure, but I do appreciate it for what it is, because without getting into my own trauma history, I find Cheryl almost cathartic to watch, and I do think that this is a step on the way to better representation, even if we're not there yet. Like, Cheryl Blossom is for the girlies who really enjoyed Girl Interrupted, but wanted it to be campier and gayer. I love that for me. My point here is that I appreciate that the show allows Cheryl to be problematic without completely vilifying her. Mr. Space Ninja claims that the show glorifies her toxic traits, but I think the show just doesn't condemn her. It's a hard sell to say that Cheryl is happy or rewarded for her behavior. After the time skip, she does end up alone and miserable, if you recall. And I don't think any character has as many scenes crying or screaming or being genuinely unhappy as Cheryl does, so there's that. But really, I don't think any of the characters are punished by the narrative for their wrongdoings. Cheryl Blossom is not the only person, quote unquote, getting away with murder. Actually, if you want to get technical, that would be Tony or Veronica. But I don't think that Riverdale is that kind of show. Moving on. But I don't think that a neurodivergent reading of her has to stop there. So going back to Friendly Space Ninja's comments, he calls out her cringy dialogue, and this is something that a lot of people bring up about Cheryl. Personally, her speech patterns read autistic to me. Why? Well, first, let's talk about masking. So, masking is basically a type of behavioral compensation that neurodivergent people across the board can use to hide the fact that they're neurodivergent. It might manifest as forcing eye contact, mimicking gestures or phrases, or rehearsing behaviors to use in social situations, among other things. The reason I bring these three up is because I believe they explain why Cheryl is so fucking odd. Because she's definitely odd, and everyone seems to be aware of how odd she is except for her. She's so strange, in fact, that when she is possessed by a ghost from ye olden times, the only person who notices is her ex, Tony. Literally no one else fucking notices. Cheryl behaves anachronistically normally, which is super weird. And when you consider that she might be using media and the people around her to build a mask, it makes more sense. This is a very common experience for people on the spectrum. And why would Cheryl act so anachronistically? Well, she certainly reads a lot and makes references to old movies, so she probably picked up a lot of her speech patterns there. She also spends an unbelievable amount of time with Nana Rose, who, that's another odd one. Not only that, but something that Friendly Space Ninja says is that he feels bad for Cheryl because she's painfully uncool, and honestly, I agree. It's like she's performing the role of cool girl to an almost comical degree. The only person who thinks Cheryl is cool is Cheryl, and later on Tony, but still, everyone else thinks she's just an awkward and mostly annoying nuisance who's easier to placate than she is to argue with. And if that ain't the autistic experience, I don't know what is. And why would Cheryl feel the need to mask? Well, a lot of neurodivergent people use masking to avoid mistreatment, and we know for a fact that when Cheryl was little, she was not liked, as exemplified in her story about Jason combining their birthday parties. So whatever is unlikable about Cheryl is something that has been with her since she was a child, and it might even predate her trauma. For the record, I'm not saying autistic people are unlikable, but we are notoriously bad with social interaction, which can be awkward, and neurotypical people don't usually like that. And it's so much more than her speech patterns that read autistic to me. It's the stiffness of her posture, the challenges she has in regulating her moods, the rage at interruptions in her routines and environment, her incredible artistic abilities, and her careful study of archery. She's a 4.0, and despite her lack of social awareness, she's really smart. It's the fact that she spends so much time alone, perfectly content to read or paint, and the fact that she has no idea how to behave with people. The scene after the key party where she presents Tony with the nursery she built for Tony's baby. Cheryl really thought this was a romantic gesture and not extremely creepy. She really thought she was going to sweep Tony off her feet with this. Bless her heart. Listen, awkward girl, very smart, like book, obsessed with red, sensitive. Cheryl Blossom has a lot of traits that could be interpreted as being signs that she's on the spectrum. She might not read that way on the surface because, well, she doesn't present with more typical traits that TV shows with autistic characters usually use. But that's the thing. Autism is a spectrum, and autistic people can have complex presentations of its traits. Not everyone is going to look like Sheldon Cooper or House. And regardless to whether or not you believe Cheryl is on the spectrum, her mental illness still places her in the realm of neurodivergence, which means that she is neurodivergent representation, period. But come on, when she starts healing and thus starts to unmask in season 6, one of her favorite methods of showing appreciation and affection is through paintings. This happens multiple times. She's so awkward. I love her so much. Yeah, maybe I'm just projecting, but don't we all when we engage with art? And that brings me back to Friendly Space Ninja's video. The next point that I will mention from his hot take is that he insists Cheryl is a bad person, and that people who think she's a victim are, in his words, insane. But my question, sir, is why you think those things are mutually exclusive. Can a person who does horrible things not also be a victim themselves? Must a character only be one thing? How are you going to sit there and whine about the lack of character development when you only want to see the surface level presentation of said character? Make it make sense. And I think an easy rebuttal here is that I'm looking too deeply into this, but maybe you're not looking deeply enough. Who decides what depths are socially acceptable to plunge? Is it because I'm looking closely at a queer female character and not a brooding masculine figure? Just asking. In response to his assertion that Cheryl is a bad person, are we obligated to sort characters into neat little folders where we only enjoy the ones whose morals are agreeable to us? I am in no way attempting to convince you that Cheryl is a good person who has never done anything wrong. However, she is a great character. Great characters do not need to be good people, and I don't know why people think that they do. It's so deeply concerning to me that people feel this way. Like, stop, get some help. We abolished the Hays Code a long time ago. And don't watch The Boys, because that show only features unrepentant pieces of shit who love murder, violence, and other morally repugnant behaviors. Oh, but wait, Friendly Space Ninja said that was one of the best shows of 2022, so we can like characters who are morally dubious. I mean, unless he hates Homelander. Oh, wait, Homelander was a highlight, even though he's a villain and has a much higher body count than Cheryl. I mean, she killed, one person by accident? But I doubt our friend the Space Ninja even knows about that because his video doesn't include season 6. And, I mean, I guess she also cut out Archie's heart, but that wasn't even her, so make it make sense. Why is it that campy shows featuring masculine leads are brilliant satire, but queer shows, and you better believe Riverdale is a queer show, are stupid and only deserving of surface-level readings? I'm just asking. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm just asking. And I'm not saying that Riverdale is perfect. Far from it. It's got a lot of problems, but I am calling out the carelessness with which people talk about it. Oh, because it's a teen show for girls and queers, it's not deserving of the same respect that we afford to more traditional pseudo-highbrow media. Media for women, queer people, and other minorities has a history of being looked down on as lesser by default. It's not serious art, it's just silly. And whether you believe that or not, we are all informed by that history. We are conditioned to believe this from birth, and to rise above it, you must make a conscious effort. So I'm not saying that people who hate Riverdale are queer-phobic, or that they hate women. I'm just saying that maybe your snap judgment of it might come from a learned place of prejudice. And that goes for everyone, myself included. I am still fighting against that conditioning every day. The internalized homophobia and chauvinism are real, and that's not even getting into the self-loathing that comes from being neurodivergent and mentally ill. We have to unlearn that, and if we don't make an effort to do so, we won't. We will continue to endorse the status quo of bias against marginalized people. So, love it or hate it, Riverdale is an important piece of queer media, and, obviously we have a long way to go in terms of lesbian representation and representation for the mentally ill, but this is a step, so don't act like it's stupid because it's not for you. And I'm not saying that Friendly Space Ninja and people like him shouldn't speak on mentally ill lesbians because he's not one. I'm just offering up a different viewpoint because I am a different person and I have a differing opinion. I think, if anything, my point here is that you shouldn't listen to him, or me, or anyone who claims they have the answer when it comes to passing judgment on art. Art is interpretive and complicated. There is no answer to art. There is only opportunity for discussion. But people don't like that. They don't have time for that. They want the quickest answer that agrees with their bias, and then they want to move on. We live in a hyper-efficient capitalist hellscape, and that has informed the way we've been talking about art for a while now. I'm just here to remind you that it doesn't have to be this way. On the surface, Riverdale might seem like it's just bad TV, but when you get in deep, you see so much more, and though I don't believe we can draw any definitive conclusions about it beyond the personal until the finale comes out, what I can say with absolute conviction is that Riverdale is not trash. Poorly executed? Sure, but it's not trash. It's not worthless. It's essential queer media. Just say you didn't get it and move on. Now, to close, I'm going to mention a few things from his video that I did agree with. Number 1, the sexualization of its teenaged characters. I do agree that this is an issue with the show, and though I do appreciate that we talk about Archie's experience with Miss Grundy being a point of trauma in season 6, I don't think that one scene solves the issue entirely, not by a long shot. Number 2, Tony Topaz. Oof. Tony Topaz is one of my biggest issues with the show. The handling of her character is abysmal at best, but not necessarily because she becomes Cheryl's pathetic pet. It's the fact that we don't really explore what that means for her. Now, I love Cheryl Blossom, but she is a toxic person, and her treatment of others is consistently abusive. The climax of her toxicity comes in season 4 when she traps Tony in Thistle House with her and her dead brother. She gaslights Tony, she guilts Tony into doing what she wants. Cheryl behaves very badly here, and though I believe it comes from a place of anxiety and pain, that doesn't excuse her behavior at all. However, it is an important story about how mental illness destroys our relationships, how the fear of losing someone can make us act like monsters. The story itself is an important one, but the fact that we don't get Tony's side of it is a huge problem. I firmly believe that Tony has a savior complex, and that she originally gets together with Cheryl because she wants to save her. I mean, that's literally how they get together. And thus, Tony's story becomes one of naive hubris. She thought she could love Cheryl to mental health, but she can't because it doesn't work that way, and in the end, living with Cheryl breaks her down until she's a shadow of her former self. I would kill for a scene where Sweet Pea or Peaches reach out to Tony and point out that they don't recognize her anymore. Maybe she wants to tell them that she's afraid of what's happening at Thistle House, but doesn't want to admit she's out of her depth, or she's afraid they'll tell her to get out of there. Or even her grandmother saying that the Blossom girl has changed Tony. We kind of get that with the graduation arc, but it's more focused on the Blossom legacy and its inherent racism, which we could also stand to talk about how Cheryl benefits and plays into that a lot more. Unfortunately, Riverdale doesn't take the time it needs with its characters, and I'm not going to dispute that at all. It focuses too much on complicated plots, and that, if anything, is the true waste of time. But I agree that Tony Topaz deserved a lot more in that plotline. She deserved to have a place in that plotline, and she really doesn't. And I would even go a step further and say that the handling of Josie McCoy is also really, really questionable. Granted, they wrote her out of the show to put her in another show, and then it does seem like Roberto wanted to put her in her own show, but unfortunately that never came to fruition. Really bummed about that, by the way. I would have loved a Josie and the Pussycats show so much. CW, please, there's still time. But my point is that the problem isn't that Tony Topaz became a less complicated character. The problem is that we didn't explore what that means for her. I think her becoming a shell of her former self is an interesting story. It's a tragic story, which fits in with a lot of the other stories of Riverdale and fits in with Cheryl pretty well. So I'm sad that we didn't actually get into the tragedy of Tony Topaz, though she does touch on it a little bit during that key party scene I mentioned earlier, where she tells Cheryl that she's not interested in getting trapped in Thistle House anymore. I kind of wish we had spent more time with it, though. But then again, I kind of wish we had spent more time with pretty much all of the character moments in Riverdale. So I guess at the end of the day, I agree with a lot of the things that Friendly Space Ninja says about Riverdale, in that it's largely mediocre and that it has a lot of problems. But I still don't think it's trash, and I do resent his outward dismissal and surface level analysis of the show. I think it deserves better than that, and I also think that a lot of my anger is very misplaced here. I'm not just angry at him, I'm honestly not angry at him at all. I'm more angry at the parade of dismissive media critics who sneer and scoff at things like Riverdale. Because Riverdale is for the girlies, and it's for the gays, it's for the lesbians, and it's for the autistics, and that's not most of the people talking about it, unfortunately, and I just think that we should allow those voices to be part of the conversation, at least, if not a big part of the conversation. And I don't think I'm reaching by saying that it's for the gays, because, I mean, at the end of the day, Roberto Aguirre Sacasa is gay. So, yeah, that's it. See you in the next one.